It's been a while, I know. I missed you all too. Today, let's wrap up on all of the three components of the exposure triangle as a whole by looking at how they interact with each other in various situations. From the three previous episodes, we learned about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You can find the links to all of them down below if you haven't watched them already. Also, subscribe for more camera and production related content. Now there's a main piece of puzzle missing from the previous episodes, and that is proper exposure. We briefly went over what overexposure and underexposure are by describing whether the sample photos are too bright or too dark. In fact, each camera has its own exposure metering system. When you point the camera at a scene, the exposure meter will show you whether the frame is properly exposed. Each step on the meter represents one stop of light. In most cases, you would want the marker to land on or near zero for proper exposure. Sometimes you hear people saying exposing to the right. It's just another way of saying overexposing the photo slightly. Similarly, exposing to the left means underexposure. Keep in mind that this meter should only be used as a reference, not an absolute rule that you always have to have it set on zero. There are many situations that you cannot fully rely on a meter, and it also depends on which metering mode you're using. We'll go deeper into metering modes and exposure compensation in another video. Previously, we learned about the effects of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO have on a photo. For aperture, the larger the aperture is, the more light is captured and the higher the exposure. The side effect is a shallower depth of field. By multiplying the aperture number by √2, which is 1.41, you would get one less stop of light. For example, if the meter is at 0 at f2.8, then it will go to -1 stop at f4 or +1 stop at f2. Next, for shutter speed. The longer the shutter speed, the more light is captured and the higher the exposure. The side effect is a more pronounced motion blur. Doubling the shutter speed increases the exposure by 1 stop. For example, if the meter is set at 0 at 100th of a second, then it will go to +1 stop at 50th of a second, or -1 stop at 200th of a second. Lastly, for ISO. The higher the ISO is, the more light is captured and the higher the exposure. The side effect is more noise in the photo. Similar to shutter speed, doubling the ISO will increase the exposure by 1 stop. For example, if the meter is at 0 at 400 ISO, then it will go to -1 stop at 200 ISO or +1 stop at 800 ISO. Alright, now let's look at a few specific shooting scenarios and decide what settings to use. Scenario 1. A fast-moving object. We want to minimize motion blur, so a quick shutter speed is used. I usually go about 1,000th of a second when I'm shooting sports or actions, but it all comes down to trial and error. Scenario 2. Light trail. Since we want to retain the motion blur, a slower shutter speed is used. Scenario 3. Low light. Well, in a low light situation, we want to maximize the light going into the camera. That usually means a wide open aperture, minimum shutter speed, and if it's still too dark, bump up the ISO as well. Scenario 4. Portraits. When we're shooting portraits, we usually want to achieve the blur background, shallow depth of field look. And if you have watched the aperture episode, you would know that this look can be achieved by using a large aperture. Getting the correct exposure is a balancing act between the three settings. As you can see, in most scenarios, we prioritize one of the three parameters and compensate using the other two. This is why cameras are equipped with aperture priority and shutter priority modes. So as a photographer, we can focus on prioritizing the specific parameter and have the camera getting the correct exposure for us. I would like to emphasize that for each scenario, there are many ways to take a picture even for the same look. It all comes down to a photographer's preference. There's no need to blindly follow a particular setting as long as you understand why each decision is made. This wraps up our Camera Basics series. We hope you liked it and learned a little more about photography. Let us know what else you would like to see. Thank you for watching and see you next time.